I never imagined the morning of my board certification exam would look like this. I was sitting at the kitchen table in my scrubs, holding a piece of paper that my hands didn't want to touch. Outside, the birds were doing what birds do, completely indifferent to the fact that my brother had just dismantled 5 years of my life in 3 paragraphs. The coffee I'd made was getting cold. I didn't care. I kept reading the note, not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because part of me kept waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They didn't. My name is Claire. I'm a 31-year-old emergency medicine physician, and I want to tell you about the day my family chose a vacation over me and the moment they realized exactly what they'd walked away from. But to understand that day, you need to understand everything that came before it. I grew up in a house where love was a limited resource, and my brother Derek had figured out early how to hoard it. He was 3 years younger than me, charming in that effortless way that made adults forget to ask questions. Where I studied quietly and kept my head down, Derek performed. He had a talent for being in the room when credit was given out and disappearing when blame needed a home. My parents never saw it, or maybe they did and found it easier not to look. When I was 16, I won a regional science scholarship, a full ride to a summer program at Johns Hopkins. I came home to tell my parents, and my mother said, "That's lovely, honey," and then turned back to Derek, who was showing her a finger painting he'd made in art class. He was 13. I'm not saying finger painting isn't art. I'm saying I'd just been accepted to Johns Hopkins and nobody looked up from the macaroni glued to construction paper. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. I paid my own way through undergrad with loans and part-time shifts at a diner where the grease permanently lived under my fingernails. Derek went to a state school on my parents' dime, changed his major 4 times, and dropped out junior year to find himself, which apparently meant moving back home and watching my parents' Netflix while they paid his phone bill. When I got into medical school, my father said he was proud of me. Then he asked if I could help Derek study for his GED. I said yes, because that's what I did. I said yes. I drove 40 minutes each way every Sunday for 6 months to sit at their kitchen table and work through practice tests with a 25-year-old man who spent most of our sessions watching YouTube on his phone. Derek got his GED. My parents threw him a party. They ordered a cake. There was no cake for medical school. I'm not even joking. There was a grocery store card with a sun on the front that said, "You did it," and inside my mother had written, "We knew you could. Love, Mom and Dad." I kept it because it was the most they'd ever said. In residency, I barely slept. I worked 30-hour shifts and came home to a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor and a refrigerator that had 3 things in it at any given time: leftover hospital cafeteria, food, orange juice, and whatever was closest to expiration at the discount grocery down the street. I called home every Sunday. My mother spent most of those calls telling me about Derek, his new girlfriend, his new job at the car dealership, his new apartment that my parents had co-signed the lease on. I never asked for a co-sign. I would never have asked. But it would have been nice to be offered. I met James during my 2nd year of residency, at a conference in Chicago. He was presenting a paper on cardiac emergency protocols, and I disagreed with one of his conclusions, and I said so, loudly, from the 3rd row of a 200-person auditorium. He laughed instead of getting defensive. By the end of the conference, we'd had dinner twice, and by the time I drove home, I knew something had shifted in my chest that I didn't fully have words for yet. We dated long distance for 8 months before I accepted a position at his hospital in Charlotte. I want to be clear. I moved for the job. The job was exceptional. James happened to also be there, which made it easier to say yes to the exceptional job. My parents thought I was being reckless. My mother called to tell me that Charlotte was very far and that I should consider the position back home closer to family. I didn't point out that being close to family had never done me many favors. James came from money. Real money, the kind that doesn't announce itself. His father had built a medical device company from nothing over 30 years, and his mother ran a nonprofit that funded rural healthcare access across 4 states. They lived in a farmhouse outside Charlotte that had been in the family for generations, and they drove sensible cars, and they wore regular clothes, and the first time I met them I didn't know any of it. James hadn't told me because, as he put it, "I didn't want you to treat me differently." I didn't realize at the time what a gift that was to be seen as just a person before anything else. His mother, Ruth, took me to the farmer's market the first Saturday I visited. We walked for 2 hours, and she asked me real questions: what I loved about emergency medicine, what scared me, what I wanted the next 10 years to look like. Nobody in my family had ever asked me what I wanted the next 10 years to look like. I nearly cried in front of the heirloom tomatoes, which felt both absurd and entirely appropriate. James proposed on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, just a regular one. In the kitchen of our apartment, when he was making pasta and I was reviewing charts at the table. He came around the counter, got down on one knee right there on the tile floor, and said, "I've been trying to think of the perfect moment, but I realized the perfect moment is any moment you're in it." The ring had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my parents that night. My mother's first question was whether we'd set a date. My father's first question was whether there would be an open bar at the reception. I said I didn't know yet to both. My mother said, "Make sure Derek gets a +1. He's been seeing someone new." That night I lay in the dark next to James and looked at the ceiling and tried to locate gratitude for what I had instead of grief for what I didn't. I was mostly successful. We set the date for October 14 months away, a Saturday, at a vineyard outside Charlotte that James's mother knew the owners of. The planning was joyful, in the way I'd always hoped wedding planning would be joyful, with Ruth and me driving out to taste wines and walk the property on Sunday afternoons. My mother came to one venue visit, spent most of it on her phone, and told me afterward that she thought a hotel ballroom would have been more practical. Derek was not invited to be in the wedding party. This was a decision I'd made carefully and privately. I asked two friends, Nadia, who'd been my study partner through all 4 years of medical school, and Jess, who I'd known since undergrad, and I left it at that. Small, simple, people who had actually shown up for me. Derek called 2 weeks after the invitations went out. "I'm not a groomsman," he said. "Not hello. Not congratulations. Just that." I explained that we were doing a small party, that James had only asked his brother and his closest friend, that it wasn't personal. "You've always done this," Derek said. "Done what?" Made me feel like an outsider in my own family. I held the phone against my ear and thought about the Sunday drives, the GED sessions, the card with the sun on the front. I thought about every birthday of his I'd called, and every holiday I'd driven home for, and every time I'd bitten my tongue when my parents told me how much potential he had, as though I were furniture in the room. "I'll see you at the wedding," I said, and I hung up. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Derek called my parents and told them that James's family was showing off by booking an expensive venue, that this whole wedding was about making our family look bad, that he refused to be humiliated. I know this because my mother called to relay it to me, her voice careful in that way it got, when she was trying to present Derek's side without technically agreeing with it. I told her I had an early shift and got off the phone. 2 weeks before the wedding, I got a group text from my mother. It said, "Derek found a great deal on flights to Miami. We're going to go support him. I know the timing isn't ideal. You'll have James's family there. We love you." I read it 4 times. Then I called Nadia. "They're going to Miami," I said. There was a long silence. Then, "Claire, they're not going to your wedding." "They're going to Miami," I said again, because saying it twice made it more real, and also somehow less possible that it was real. Nadia drove over that night with wine and a fierceness I've always loved her for, and we sat on the kitchen floor because that's where we ended up. And she said things I needed to hear and some things I didn't, and by midnight I had cried enough that I felt scraped out and clean in the way you do after you've finally let yourself feel the full weight of something. James held me after she left. He didn't say much. He knew by then that there were certain shapes of grief words couldn't improve. His parents found out the next morning. I didn't tell them I think Ruth overheard James on the phone with his brother. She knocked on our bedroom door at 8 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand and said, "You have us." That has always been true, and it will still be true on Saturday. I cried again. I seem to be doing a lot of that. I made a note to rehydrate. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 5:30. The house was quiet. My dress was hanging on the back of the closet door, and the October light was coming through the curtains in that gold, unhurried way, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt something that might have been peace. Then I saw the envelope on the doormat that had been slid under the door sometime before I woke. It was from Derek. I knew his handwriting before I opened it. Inside, there was a single page. He had written, in the careful script that meant he'd drafted it multiple times, that I had always thought I was better than everyone else, that going to medical school and moving away was just my way of rejecting the family that had loved me, that James's money would never fill what was actually missing in me, that he hoped I had a nice wedding with my nice rich husband and his nice rich family, and that this was the last communication he intended to have with me. I folded it. I put it on the table. I drank my cold coffee. Then I went and put on my dress. Nadia and Jess arrived at 8. They found me sitting at the vanity, already halfway through my mascara, and Nadia looked at the letter on the table and then at me, and I shook my head once and she picked it up and put it in her purse without a word. I have never asked her what she did with it. I don't want to know. Ruth arrived with her sisters and 3 of her friends from her nonprofit board, and they filled the house with noise and laughter and mimosas, and someone put music on, and James's sister did my hair because her hands were steadier than the actual hairstylist's, and somewhere in the middle of all of it I looked around at the room at these women who had chosen to be here, who had rearranged their lives to stand in this house on this morning, and the grief that had been sitting on my chest quietly got smaller. Not gone, just smaller. The vineyard was 40 minutes out, through roads that had gone orange and red and amber in the way only October in the Carolinas can manage. I rode with Ruth and James's father, William, who spent the whole drive telling me a story about the worst day of his own wedding, which involved a florist, a missing boutonniere, and what he called a minor incident with a goat. And by the time we turned onto the vineyard drive, I was laughing in a way that came from somewhere real. There were 112 guests. James's family alone could account for most of them: cousins, colleagues, family, friends, board members from the company, people from Ruth's nonprofit, people from the hospital. My side was small. Nadia, Jess, 3 colleagues from my residency program, 2 friends from undergrad, and my attending from my first year who had driven 4 hours because, as she said in her card, I watched you become a doctor. I'm not missing this. The ceremony was outside, under the oldest oak tree on the property, and the light came through the leaves the way light comes through leaves in the fall, filtered and golden, and a little heartbreaking in the best way. James cried before I even reached him. His brother had to hand him a handkerchief. William put his hand on my back at the top of the aisle and said, "Ready?" And I said, "More than anything," and that was true. What we didn't know, what none of us knew until 2 days later, was that the ceremony had been filmed. Not by a wedding videographer, though we had one of those. William's company had a partnership with a local Charlotte news affiliate, and one of the station's producers had attended as a guest. She had spent most of the reception talking to Ruth. And somewhere in the conversation the story had come up: the physician bride, the family that didn't come, the community of chosen people who showed up instead. The producer had asked permission to run a short human interest piece. Ruth had said yes. I hadn't known. I was 3 days into my honeymoon in Portugal when my phone started to behave strangely. It had been doing this, I thought at first, because of the international settings. Then I looked. The piece had run on the local affiliate on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, it had been picked up by 2 regional networks. By Tuesday morning, it had been picked up nationally. The headline, which I saw first as a screenshot Nadia sent me, said, "She showed up. ER doctor's wedding becomes a lesson in chosen family." There was a photo from the ceremony, me and James under the oak tree, light everywhere, his face turned toward me like I was the only object in the frame. There was a quote from Ruth about community and the families we build. There was a brief mention, attributed to people close to the bride, of the family members who had not attended. My phone was ringing before I finished the article. My mother called 11 times between 8 and 10 Tuesday morning. My father called twice. Derek called once, then twice, then 7 more times within the hour. I watched the notifications come in from my hotel room in Lisbon while James sat next to me and didn't say anything, because he understood that this was one of those moments that didn't need words. I did not answer. I want to be clear about something. I didn't feel triumphant, sitting there in that hotel room. I didn't feel the hot satisfaction of revenge or the clean snap of justice. What I felt was quieter than that and harder to name, something like the moment after a long shift when you finally sit down and realize how tired you've been carrying weight you stopped noticing. I felt it land, what they'd done, what they'd chosen. And then I felt it begin to let go. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, and James ordered breakfast from room service, and we ate on the balcony looking out at the Tagus River, and I thought, this is my life now. This is what I built. When we returned to Charlotte 2 weeks later, there was a stack of letters at the apartment. 3 from my mother, 1 from my father, 2 from Derek. I didn't open any of them. I handed them to James, who put them in a box in the closet. They're still there. I may deal with them someday. I haven't had the urgency. The article had consequences neither my family nor I had anticipated. Ruth's nonprofit received 3 significant donations in the weeks after the piece ran, specifically from people who cited the story about chosen family. The hospital's communications team asked if I'd be willing to do a brief interview for their internal newsletter. 2 of my attendings stopped me in the hallway to say things I wasn't sure how to receive and accepted awkwardly, because accepting kindness gracefully is a skill I am still developing. And Nadia, who had been thinking about applying for a research grant for 2 years, finally submitted the application. She said the story had reminded her that the people who show up deserve to see you succeed. She got the grant 6 months later. I cried at the email notification, which was unprofessional, and I stand by it. Derek, as far as I know, is still in Miami. My parents are still in the house I grew up in. I don't know what the Miami trip was like. I haven't asked. I imagine they had a fine time. I imagine they looked at their phones and saw the article and felt something: embarrassment, anger, regret, or maybe a combination of all 3 in proportions I can't calculate from here. I imagine Derek composed his 7 phone calls from somewhere with good weather and poor judgment. It's not my job to understand their math anymore. What I know is this. The morning I slid my grandmother's ring, James's grandmother's ring, onto my finger, in front of 112 people who had come because they wanted to be there, nobody who was absent made that smaller. The oak tree didn't care. The October light didn't care. James's face didn't care. And neither, I realized, did I. Somewhere between the letter on the doormat and the balcony in Lisbon, I had stopped waiting for my family to become the people I needed them to be. I had stopped auditing the years for signs they might have loved me differently. I had stopped running the calculation that started with "if only they had" and ended nowhere useful. I have a husband who got on his knees on a Tuesday in the kitchen because he couldn't wait for a more convenient moment. I have a mother-in-law who asks what I want the next 10 years to look like and actually waits for the answer. I have a best friend who put my brother's letter in her purse without being asked and never brought it up again. I have a attending who drove 4 hours for a ceremony she wasn't obligated to witness. I have a life that is full of people who chose me. And I have learned, slowly, and not without difficulty, that being chosen by the right people is worth so much more than being kept by the wrong ones. My brother thought he was leaving me with nothing. He left me with the clearest view I've ever had of exactly what I had. The best thing about finally letting go is how much lighter you are when you walk into what's next. I walked into it in a white dress, under an oak tree, in October light, surrounded by everyone who mattered. That's the whole story. That's enough.